Hello, all, and welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown, your weekly look at the IT news of the week, brought to you by Gestalt IT. I'm the editor of Gestalt IT, Rich Stroffolino, and I'm joined here by not just my usual co-host, Tom Hollingsworth, down. He's in the corner that way. Hi, Tom. How is it going?
It's great.
But we also have some of the brightest minds that you've seen here featured on the Gestalt IT Rundown in recent weeks. We, of course, have the fabulous below me, Ken Nalbone. Ken, thank you for being here. He's looking up. This is a Brady Bunch situation going on.
I got it to work. Yeah, I figured it out.
And to my left on the video, directions are very hard. We have the big boss man himself, Mr. Storage, Stephen Foskett. Stephen, how are you?
I'm ready to rumble.
That I appreciate.
That's scary.
Was that a reference to me calling you Big Boss Man? Because if so, your wrestling acumen is unexpected. All right, guys. So we've gathered the meeting of the minds here to kind of talk about what was the biggest IT story of 2018, and I think IT is varied enough. That's kind of the reason we have Gestalt IT, is to kind of bring together some of the disparate threads in enterprise IT, whether it be, storage, networking, cloud, whatever I'm supposed to represent up here. And, I don't think there's any one thing that we would all agree upon. So I wanted to kind of get everybody's take about what the biggest story of IT. There was, of course, a number of acquisitions. And one of the things that we covered extensively here on the Gestalt IT Rundown was, of course, the non-acquisition of Broadcom swallowing up Qualcomm that never ended up happening. But that kind of leads into what I thought was one of the biggest stories that really developed late in the year. And that is, of course, kind of everything that's going on with 5G in the Huawei versus the US and or allies kind of situation that's going on here. This kind of most recently blew up with the arrest of their CFO in Canada, kind of at the US behest, possible extradition into the country. But I think that is just the latest in what has been a year-long kind of campaign by the US to really poison the well for Huawei when it comes to 5G infrastructure. And I think that's a really, really important story that's going to have impacts. I mean, clearly, as 5G rolls out and beyond, and has impacts, for the companies that aren't Huawei. We're talking about Nokia, we're talking about Samsung, some of the other infrastructure companies. I mean, I think could have a really big benefit. So I just want to run down this timeline to kind of give everybody some perspective of where we are at. We had, starting way back in January, right, coming out of CES, AT&T was all set to announce a Huawei phone. Famously, no major U.S. carriers kind of carry a Huawei phone. You can use them, but they won't sell you one. They were all set to sell one. And according to Reuters, they were told basically the U.S. Government put pressure on them to not carry the phone and to kind of cut ties with the company. In January 29th, Bloomberg reported that Verizon was dropping plans to carry Huawei phones, and it was under pressure from the U.S. government to stop working in collaboration with Huawei on 5G standards. Fast forward to February, we have CNBC reporting that the 6 U.S. intelligence agencies recommending to the Senate Intelligence Committee that the American citizens not use products or services from Huawei or ZTE. ZTE, of course, had their own bumpy year this year. Fast forward all the way to kind of the end of summer here. We had in August, President Trump signed a ban on Huawei and ZTE for government and contractor use. Then we see some a little bit more interesting, some more international, kind of some more allied news. We have Australia blocking Huawei and ZTE 5G equipment in the same month. We have in November, the Wall Street Journal reporting that allies are being briefed on not using Huawei 5G infrastructure, kind of the U.S. being very proactive with this, possibly even subsidizing the purchase of non-Huawei equipment. And then kind of following that, we have Deutsche Telekom saying they're going to review Huawei infrastructure for 5G. We have Orange in the UK saying that they're not going to use, we have Orange saying that they're not going to use Huawei equipment for 5G in France. We have BT saying they're going to remove Huawei equipment from 3G and 4G mobile core infrastructure and not use it at all in 5G mobile core infrastructure, although use it in some other instances. Then we have New Zealand rejecting an application by the telecom Spark to use Huawei 5G equipment. So it seems like this blitz by the U.S. To kind of say, hey, allies, you like the U.S., don't use Huawei. What is the implication here? Because Huawei is still the elephant in the room. I mean, they're the de facto choice, basically, in most of the world, certainly not in the U.S., seems like at least Western Europe and the Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand countries are not really, are kind of under the U.S.'s sway a little bit here when it comes to Huawei. I mean, what do we think the long-term implications are here for 5G rollout, for Huawei, and for some of the competitors like Nokia? Tom, I'm really interested in your take on this.
So it's kind of funny because there's been a Cold War against Huawei for at least the last 3 years that I can remember. There are stories of people saying they were going to install Huawei wireless wide area network access points. And then an unmarked government car comes up and people start asking you a whole bunch of funny questions. There was a lawsuit from Cisco alleging that Huawei stole code. And that was actually proven to be true. They literally lifted code from Cisco and implemented it there. But I think that the Huawei versus US story is actually a much bigger story in regards to the fact that it seems to be the US versus Chinese native companies, not just Huawei and ZTE. I mean, if I asked you to name the top 3 cloud providers in the world, I almost guarantee you'd leave out Alibaba Cloud, because nobody does any advertising for them, and the only people that use them are non-US organizations. It's like the US doesn't want anybody to believe that the Chinese are capable of making things that are not iPhones. And the narrative is now becoming, it's not a Cold War of, don't use them, use us. Now people are starting to take active measures to shut them out of the market. And that's going to end badly for everybody.
Well, and that's why I brought up Qualcomm Broadcom acquisition, because that was officially killed by an executive order from President Trump. And we saw a couple other instances where the Committee on Foreign Investment recommended that Chinese companies not be allowed to either, or Chinese investment firms or other companies not be allowed to acquire US-based either semiconductor companies. I think Lattice Semiconductor was a company last year that didn't get, basically had a acquisition axed, and a couple other instances where that came up, where previously that the Committee on Foreign Investment really does not get involved, especially on publicly traded companies. Historically, let's at least the shareholders vote on it, and then we'll creep in for a publicly traded company. Long term, is this just going to be a continuing trend, and is this only the most obvious because Huawei is kind of this giant gorilla?
I have another question for you guys. We look at U.S. intelligence agencies making a recommendation that people not use Huawei equipment, framing it as possibly a national security issue, but it looks like more of a trade war issue with China that's just kind of using that national security response as an excuse. Do you think it's one or the other, or a little bit of both?
I think it's a lot. I think a lot of it has to do with basically making Huawei specifically, and kind of the idea of doing business in China, just seem as unpleasant as possible, because I think Huawei is a big enough company that they can be price competitive, they can be feature competitive in a lot of different ways. But I think that by the U.S. just saying we're going to make it hell to do business, maybe we're not going to sanction you, but we're still the U.S. government. You still are operating in the U.S. We can make things very difficult for you if you continue on this way. And I think that is, in some ways, perhaps is why we're seeing the U.S. trying to extradite the CFO up in Canada. Yes, there's ostensibly trade violations with doing business in Iran and stuff like that. Very serious, and of course, something that the U.S. has as an interest in enforcing. Is it coincidental that before she could kind of disembark and change planes in Canada, no problem, and all of a sudden we're arresting the CFO of Huawei? I don't think that's a coincidence.
And it's interesting too that the fact that apparently although some people in the government were aware that was going to happen, apparently the big guy who was literally meeting with the big guy from China at that exact moment hadn't been told. I'd say there's something wrong in your organizational structure when that happens.
I mean, to be fair, no matter who would be present, I feel like the higher up the chain you go, the less they want to hear about 5G infrastructure in general. So I don't think that's necessarily an indictment not to give anyone the benefit of a doubt that doesn't need it.
Well, but political arrests do cause political problems.
This is true.
So
maybe
honestly, I think that's the real story here. I'm sorry to jump in there, but the real story to me on Huawei is the politics angle. It's about containing China. It's about worrying about espionage. It's really not a technical story at all.
Yeah, well, to me, that's why it's kind of the biggest story, because by making it a political story, by it being kind of a political story, you're losing, a viable competitor in a number of markets. And obviously you're going to see reciprocity. We already see that it's extremely difficult for U.S. companies without partnering with Chinese companies to operate in the country, and probably increasingly in the region. So I don't think that's going to change. So I think that will have major impacts for organizations that operate internationally, because they're going to have to make some tough choices because of political concerns. All right, Stephen, I wanted to cue you up for what you thought was your big story of 2018, and I think it has something to do with James Bond, right?
Yeah, no, actually, it's so basically there's been a story that broke literally right after New Year's and has been consuming the tech industry ever since, to varying extents. But it's the gift that keeps on giving to people who are following tech, and that is Spectre and Meltdown. Essentially, on January 3rd, the news broke that researchers had unveiled a few years earlier proof of concept ways of breaking the security between threads on a CPU. And this sounds very, very picky and weird, but essentially it breaks computing, because if there's no security between this process and that process, then you can snoop on what's going on in the CPU, and you can basically, exfiltrate data, you can exfiltrate keys. It can cause all sorts of problems. And of course, it causes huge problems in multi-tenant architecture on the data of other customers on the same hardware as you on AWS, for example. And the facts are that it absolutely does work. It is not just a concept, it totally works. But I think the bigger story, at least for IT, has been the insane response to it. So shortly after the news broke, Google and Intel and Microsoft came out with patches and approaches to fixing it. The Intel patch was so bad that Linus Torvalds, no shrinking violet there, called it complete and utter garbage, and servers were crashing. It was so bad that people were saying, just be vulnerable, don't install this. Over time, there's been somewhat better patches for it. There's been conflicting ideas about whether we should install the patches or not. What should we do about this thing? Also, over time, we've seen more and more similar flaws. So in May, what they call Spectre NG, next generation, showed more flaws. Shortly after, a few other flaws were announced. Even here in November, even more similar vulnerabilities were released. And I think the most telling article was actually one from PC World, of all things, which basically said, you know what? We'll never fix this until we have an entirely new type of processor. How disappointing is that? So that's basically the story that is just keeps coming all year long.
And Stephen, I think it's kind of fascinating that right after Spectre and Meltdown were announced, people said, oh, well, theoretically we can patch this, but it's going to cost you 15 to 25% of your CPU performance, which kind of says that maybe Intel's been beating around the bush and trying to cheat Moore's Law for the last, 3 or 4 CPU revisions, because that's how far back this architecture has to go in order for it to be this embedded.
Even further, actually, I think.
Yeah, it just feels disingenuous. It's like, hey, we kept ramping the speed up, but as soon as we pulled the rug out from underneath you by getting it such a low level attack, look at how bad things are really going to get.
And then, of course, there was another flaw that came out later this year called L1TF, and the remediation for that is not a patch. It's turn off hyperthreading. Just don't use it. Well, and it's just ridiculous.
Intel has released some CPUs now which don't have hyperthreading. Because of course core count is going up, so maybe hyperthreading isn't such a good idea.
So
those PowerPC guys aren't going to shut up about it now, because you get 8 threads per core, way better than Intel. PowerPC making a comeback, right?
Does anyone want to stand for MIPS at this point, or are we not going to do that? So is this a argument against, hey, x86 has hit this peak of complexity that it's just this unmanageable morass where these kind of exploits are just going to be there because the kind of the architecture is so old and so kind of grafted upon? Is this an argument against complex CPUs? And who do we think is going to be the most affected by, end users? Yeah, patch, sure, but this is a who's this bigger for? I guess public cloud providers or your enterprise deployments.
And I think that's probably the big story for our enterprise audience. And interestingly, right from the very beginning, some of the enterprise tech companies were saying, we don't need to patch this because third-party code doesn't run on our systems. So if you're making a network switch or a storage array or something like that, it's a valid question. If the system is not capable of running third-party software, or if it's only capable of running third-party software that could be filtered or controlled in some way, maybe it doesn't need a patch. Maybe this is fine. And similarly, the other kind of technical angle that we're seeing is this idea of, if we've got insane numbers of cores, which of course is the other kind of big tech story of the second half of the year with Epic and with the ARM CPUs and everything, maybe what we should do is just isolate cores or isolate whole processors. I mean, maybe we can just throw hardware at the problem. It's a thought.
I mean, that throws a lot of cold water, though, on kind of the promise of something like composable infrastructure, right? Where it's just, hey, we can just throw in CPU cores no matter where they live. That would seem problematic to a number of trends that we see enterprise seemingly wanting to embrace, at least long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the whole idea of changing CPU architecture to mitigate all these terrible security flaws just reminds me of trying to switch the US to the metric system. People have been talking about doing it for decades. It ain't going to happen.
Well, one company, though, that is at least maybe putting a toe in those waters is Amazon with AWS, kind of at reInvent. One of their big announcements that seemed to get a lot of steam was that they were going to be launching instances running on their own custom ARM CPU. And that kind of leads into, Ken, with what you wanted to talk about, which was, kind of AWS and their influence on the enterprise.
That's right. And I wanted to come up with a timeline for this story highlighting AWS announcements since the beginning of the year, and I couldn't. There were so many, I lost count, and there was an account out there that I could easily find. But essentially, the story is that AWS, if anything, is picking up steam, not slowing down. They're stepping on the gas. They're top of mind because they just had reInvent, and Andy Jassy was up there for 3 hours for a keynote, starting off with talking about their market share, 51%. The next closest competitor is Azure with 13%. And then continue to just rattle off announcement after announcement of new products for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes. And we see not only continued release of products that are relevant to the developers and the startups who are trying to build something new, all those new cloud services that managed blockchain or managed Kafka or whatever, but also those enterprise services that those customers who are starting to begin their cloud journey, who have a lot of technical debt that's difficult to overcome before they can actually dip their toes into cloud native, there's something for them too. Outposts, making it easy to have applications running on the same framework, whether they're in your data center or in AWS's cloud. Glacier Deep Archive, guess what? You don't have to manage tapes anymore. Let us do it for you. We're not going to tell you it's tapes on the back end, but come on, it is. And now it's their problem, not yours. Or, hey, you're a big Windows shop. You can't start using Linux. Guess what? We have the FSX Windows-based file system available for you. And that's just a sample of things. So, we're not going to see any end to AWS's domination anytime soon, especially now that they are embracing the enterprise. And not only that, we're seeing more and more services come out that, unfortunately, are making other companies, irrelevant. I was telling Rich before we started, I know a guy who recently moved out to Silicon Valley to work for a company that was kind of in the startup mode based around an open source product. And guess what? AWS just announced their own managed offering on that same open source product. So I kind of wonder what's going to happen to him and all those other companies that develop some great new service. And then AWS just swoops in and says, we're going to do that too. So regardless of what you do, you're a startup, you're creating something, you're an enterprise, or you're building your own service, AWS is going to be top of mind.
So Ken, let me ask you a question on that, because one of the big things that we hear a lot in a lot of briefings, especially when we're talking to cloud companies, is everyone is really hot, especially when they're doing any kind of managed, service on top of the cloud or something like that, that, hey, multi-cloud, everyone's interested in, this is going to be happening. Is the domination of AWS and kind of this IT mindset, does that make the priority of multi-cloud, does that diminish it, or does that increase it as we do we want to go whole hog into AWS, or do we want to always have that fallback position? Because right now it's 51%, but they don't seem to be letting off the gas. They seem to be wanting to go for the throat.
So here's my opinion on multi-cloud. I don't think any customers are building a new application or architecture with multiple clouds in their mindset when they start. I think what you're seeing is they stuck this application on AWS, maybe that one on Azure, maybe this one's staying on premises, and they might need to be able to communicate with each other, or you might need to be able to get data from one to the other, but you're not seeing many customers actually kind of distribute things so that they can just jump from one to the other. I don't think anybody's made that simple enough yet that it's an actual valid strategy, if you see what I'm getting at here.
No.
So yeah, you're going to see multi-cloud as a strategy for an enterprise as a whole, but for specific workloads, specific lines of business applications, you're not going to see that anytime soon.
And do we think let's do some predictions here. It's the end of the year. We have to do at least one prediction, right? That's the obligation of any gathering of more than 2 people at this time of year. In, let's say, 3 to 4 years, is this a 2-horse race? Is this still I think commonly we like to think of it as, sure, AWS, yeah, you got Azure as a solid second, and Google Cloud, who's kind of coming in third there. Is this a 2-horse race at that point with AWS and then kind of Microsoft living in their own, Microsoft world? Or do we start talking about AWS as a monopoly at that point?
That's a good point. I don't think they're going to be a monopoly forever. I think there is enough innovation coming from other clouds, particularly Azure. Now that AWS is trying to focus more on the enterprise, it's less going to be Microsoft's, sole stronghold with Azure, but they're still growing. They're still going to continue to, which is why Amazon basically sees them as a threat, in my opinion. Yeah, 13% is a lot smaller than 15, but I don't have the numbers in front of me. It's bigger than it was last year. It's going to continue to grow. And we are going to see, probably my prediction will be that Azure will be close to, if not at 20% by the end of next year.
Okay. Wow. Well, and I do think, to your point of there being innovation, I know, Tom, I know you usually like to give a shout out to Larry Ellison at some point. I do think it's interesting, like what a company like Oracle, which you like to think of them as a stodgy old Oracle. They just have their bags and bags of cash and they're going to screw you no matter what, or something like that. But I do think they have a really interesting kind of angle when it comes to cloud, kind of being, this bare metal high performance, kind of thought to that, going more infrastructure as a service focused. Now, that isn't to say that AWS could disrupt that overnight if they really, really wanted to. I think that's the problem for a lot of the innovation that we're seeing, is that, whatever angle, whatever kind of niche you want to go for, AWS does have the resource to kind of blow you up at the next reInvent among their 5 billion other announcements, right? Okay.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And yes, shout out to friend of the show, Larry Ellison. Larry, I love your island volcano layer. It's coming along nicely, but you're not going to win. I mean, let's face it. At this point, I don't even think you're going to place or show. Yeah, the multi-cloud is still going to be a thing. I'll tell you, in 5 years, this will still be a 3-horse race. Spoiler alert, the third horse is one you haven't been talking about. It's not going to be Google, and it's definitely not going to be Oracle. It's going to be somebody else. It's a dark horse coming out of nowhere. And that's
coming
the
out
key
of
to cloud.
China. Can I suggest that?
You may be right. That's why nobody's ever heard of them. But the thing is that Oracle Cloud only lives as long as Larry Ellison wants to keep pumping cash into it. And Amazon has made huge strides this year to get rid of their Oracle presence. What do you think is going to happen when Amazon's not using Oracle anymore? Amazon was probably one of the largest consumers of Oracle. You can only buy so many ads in Iron Man movies before people stop believing that you're actually useful.
So is AWS the deep state that is setting the agenda for U.S. Huawei relations and Ali Cloud and stuff like that? No, I'm just kidding. Speaking of people that own private islands or can afford to, Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook. Tom, I think you had something on the subject.
I think he owns Tom too.
Yes. Oh, for sure.
No. I'm 100% MySpace. So I think the biggest story of 2018 was the Facebook data breach, and the fact that you're sitting there watching this on Facebook, asking yourself which one is he talking about, should give you an idea of how bad it is. I literally typed in Facebook data breach, looking for ones that were not related to Cambridge Analytica, and I found 2 of them I didn't even know about. Did you know that there was one released this morning? Spotify could read your private messages. Here's the problem. This is a symptom of a larger issue. Facebook collects data. This is not a data lake. This isn't even a data Great Salt Lake. This is the data Pacific Ocean at this point. Facebook knows more about me than my mom and all of my family members combined. Facebook could tell me things I don't know about me. And you know what they're doing with that data? They're not keeping it safe. They're not using it for the greater good. They're selling it. They are selling access to it. And you know what? They're not even bothering to check the credentials of the people. Why would Spotify need access to my private messages? Now, when you ask the Spotify people, you know what they'll say? We didn't know we had access to that data. Why would you do that? Their chief security officer quit this year. He was so fed up with things, he bailed. He couldn't take it anymore. Friend of the show, robot Mark Zuckerberg, stood up in front of the Senate and got grilled and gave a masterclass in how not to answer questions for an hour about simple things like who has access to my data. Cambridge Analytica is the tip of a very large, very dark iceberg at this point. Facebook, and by extension, Google, can no longer be trusted with our data because I can't ensure they're going to keep my identity secure.
So, Tom, let me ask you a question. One of the big stories, and one that we didn't bring up, maybe this exposes a little bit of our U.S. bias, is kind of the realities of a post-GDPR world. Kind of what you're describing here seems to beg for, some sort of privacy or some kind of data sovereignty guidelines, laws, dare I say, regulation in the U.S. Do you see, is the severity of what we're seeing from Facebook and the fact that we're seeing the CEOs of Facebook, Google, kind of doing their time in front of senators on Capitol Hill, is that going to set up in 2019? Is data privacy a 2020 election issue?
It very well could be, and there's two reasons for that. The first is obviously GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was passed in the European Union this year, and that caused a lot of scrambling because people had to figure out how GDPR was going to apply to them. Facebook announced that they were going to extend the GDPR-style protections to all of their users, not just the ones who live in the EU. California passed a law, or was threatening to pass a law, that was going to be as strict as GDPR, and given the fact that Facebook's headquarters is right in the middle of California, that would have affected them massively. And you know what's changed since May? Nothing. Like literally, GDPR is threatening to fine you 3 or 4% of your annual gross revenue. And Facebook goes, ha, 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 we don't care. That's how bad it is. They are a sieve. They are a screen door on a submarine. You can get access to anything you want if you're willing to pay for it. And they don't seem to care because all they care about is bad PR. If they can spin this, if they can make it look good, if somebody can write another book that everybody wants to quote in startup culture, they don't care.
I think the point there is that just really it's the sentiment of the customers that matter. And we're not talking about the users necessarily. It's the people who are trying to get to that data. And, do they care about protecting privacy as well? Maybe they will if regulation exists. I'll concede that to a degree, but it also just matters what the attitude is of us, the consumers. If we start caring more, and not us, the four of us here, the tech guys who understand the risks, but your mother and father and aunt and grandkids or whoever who are on Facebook. No, your grandkids aren't on Facebook. They're too young. But everybody else who is on, if they're even aware of the data breaches, do they care? They should, but they probably don't. And that's not really going to affect change anytime soon.
I think that the big issue here is that the next generation is really soaking in it. And they're not maybe as concerned about this stuff as us. I think you'll get a lot of ironic answers from them and kind of cynical answers from them that, I have no privacy. Everything's going to be breached. What's going to happen? I don't care. I don't know. I think you will get a very different answer. And I think that doesn't bode well for us as a society and as people, because basically if they're, the next few generations are resigned to this stuff, that's what we got.
Yeah. Well, I do think there is maybe, I don't want to say hope. That's too optimistic a word. I do think we're starting to see at least some companies, not Facebook, maybe not, and problematic given that they have like 2 billion users or something ridiculous like that. But there was a story I think last week or 2 weeks ago that Microsoft is kind of seeking out, is calling for regulation on things like facial recognition, where you could pair this data that Facebook's scraping from all over the web and kind of really pair it in some really creepy ways and give at least some kind of visibility for that. I'm sure Microsoft is doing it for they don't want to get sued later on when they have Windows Hello installed on every single laptop ever or something like that. I do think that there is some awareness of that, especially now that with companies that do have to operate, in areas where GDPR is the reality. But unfortunately, yeah, I don't think unless there is, some kind of collective will to kind of, say privacy has a value or something or privacy is a right or something like that, right? And we put some kind of teeth to it. In the U.S. specifically, I think that people are going to play fast and loose as long as they're able to, because there's money to be made.
Well, and I
this
think
reminds me of a question.
Ken, you go ahead.
I was going to say, this reminds me of a question I had. It's only kind of related. I wonder what the sales are on that Facebook portal thing with the screen that you can chat with people. Does anybody think that's a good idea? I guess some people are buying it. Nobody I know wants one. They think it's creepy. But
I think the only people who would actually want it are the people who aren't going to buy it, which is the younger people, because they don't freaking use Facebook anymore because it's so old people.
Yeah. I think the biggest problem that we're running into right now, Rich, when you talk about regulations and you talk about that, is in order to have regulations, you have to have an oversight group, whether it be the government or some kind of regulatory body that says we need to have this. Facebook proved this year that, would you rather regulate us, or would you rather us help you get elected? Whether or not it's us or somebody who's drawing on our data, they basically the die is cast, the Rubicon is crossed. Facebook knows enough about all of us right now to be able to affect things on a large scale. Do you want to bet against it and find yourself on the outside looking in? Or do you want to cozy up to those people, get paid, and keep your job? Somebody's going to have to choose sides sooner or later.
Alia jacta est, as Julius Caesar would say. So I think on that highly depressing note, I think we're going to leave the Gestalt IT Rundown for 2018. But is there any source of hope? Is there any source of salvation that we can find? Sure. Containers are a thing. So we'll be good. If you want to find out more non-depressing news, Tom does write things on gestaltit.com that won't make you cry and have nightmares. So you can find that at gestaltit.com. I write there as well. Ken writes there as well. And hey, Stephen Foskett writes there as well. Let's go around the horn here. I guess we'll start with Ken going down to the bottom there. Ken, where can people find you on social media and any other writing?
Find me on Twitter as @Ken Nalbone. I'm on LinkedIn too sometimes, but Twitter is my platform of choice. When I'm not writing on Gestalt IT, I'm occasionally writing on fullstackkengineer.com. And make sure you watch our Tech Field Day videos live. You're going to see me introing a bunch of companies in the coming months.
Tom?
You can find me on Twitter as @NetworkingNerd. You can find my snarky blog at networkingnerd.net. You can find the good stuff at gestaltit.com. And if you want to check out my Bruce Wayne job, techfieldday.com.
And Stephen.
I'm Batman. You can find me at sfoskett on the Twitters and sfoskett pretty much everywhere else. And my blog is blog.foskets.net, where I post things that don't go on Gestalt IT. But frankly, lately I've been posting most of my stuff on Gestalt IT because I'm all consumed with this enterprise thing.
All right, and you can find me on Twitter at Mr. Anthropology. That's MR Anthropology. And never fear, the Gestalt IT Rundown will return in 2019. We'll have another great weekly look at the IT news that matters to you and occasionally won't make you cry. Larry, I know you're upset that we won't be here through the rest of the year, but just snuggle up tight in that private island. It'll be okay. Until the next time we meet, have a happy new year and have a super sparkly day.